a number of them, but it's sort of like you. The first friend that I ever remember sharing the gospel with was kind of a special thing to me. I think we were 7 or 8 or 9. I don't know. I was fairly young, but he was a friend that lived in the cul-de-sac across the street, and this was in the Orlando area. And so we would play in the cul-de-sac all day long. It was probably good for my health, but I kind of miss those days. It's harder to send your kids outside to play. You don't know what's going to happen to them. But back then I felt like we spent all day outside and the same kind of thing. Basketball, football, whatever, that's what we did. The reason why I wanted to talk about friends is because we're dealing with a section of Jeremiah that is about enemy nations. To try to recap where we are, since we are right at the end of the book of Jeremiah, chapter 49 of the book of Jeremiah is where we are. To try to recap, Jeremiah has been a faithful prophet for a very long time. This book that talks about him is not in chronological order, but it does describe the major events that took place around the kingdom of Judah. The leftover Israelites, descendants of Jacob, God's people that we've learned about in the Old Testament, all up to this time, have rejected God so long, so consistently, that God has finally said, I'm done with you guys, punishment's coming. And punishment came in the form of a large nation called Babylon. The nation of Babylon. So this huge, powerful group of people defeated the Assyrians and the Egyptians, became the new world power, and they deported tons of Israelites, people of Judah. And Jeremiah preached all throughout that time. He told them as a prophet, guys, straighten up your act or God's going to punish you. Guess what? You haven't straightened up your act. God is going to punish you. And they said, nah, God wouldn't do that. Nah, God wouldn't do that. He just wouldn't do that. Then he did. And they were in denial and said, nah, God's going to fix it. God's going to make it right. He wouldn't punish us for long. And Jeremiah said, no, he is going to punish you for a long time. It's going to be 70 years in exile. But they said, no, they couldn't believe it. But it happened. And now we're at the period of time where a lot of people are starting to figure out that this is for real, but there are plenty others who are in exile and who are scattered that still haven't quite gotten this around their head. They're thinking, I think God's going to let us come back. Surely this is painful enough, right? This is what I needed. But Jeremiah the prophet the whole time has the exact same message. So what's the nickname of Jeremiah? What is the nickname he gets as a prophet often? The weeping prophet. And why do they call him the weeping prophet? Because the people never seem to listen to what he's saying. And he feels for them. He doesn't want, it's like a warning sign. There's a cliff ahead. Don't go that way. Don't go that way. The bridge, and nobody listens. And he genuinely cares. And he has to watch person after person, leader after leader, all of his people, his own people, go downhill. And he has been faithful to God this whole time. He's cried out several times saying, God, I can't do this anymore. And God's answer has always been what? Keep going. You quit when I say you quit, essentially. I'll tell you when you can't do it anymore. And somehow, some way, God kept him going. Clear up to the point where now he's an old man. And it's funny, a lot of times when I think of getting old and stuff, I think, oh, that's where you start saying, can't do things anymore, not like I used to and stuff. Well, Jeremiah, if anything, seems like the opposite. He seems like the kind of older person that is not making excuses anymore. It's just, nope, I'm going to do it. And he does it. And people encourage him to quit. They call him out. And he's unfazed. God really did bolster him and strengthen him. There are some good examples of older people. Him, a guy like Caleb, if you remember earlier in the Old Testament. So Jeremiah is in a section now where in the book, not in chronological order like we said, but it's a section of foreign nation oracles. So 46, 47, 48, 49, all the way down through the end, we've got lists of all of these different nations that he's calling out, which is important. Because the people needed to know it's not just you. You're not the only ones getting punished. Now there's a good reason why the Israelites, I'll call them that because they're descendants of Israel, there's a good reason why they should get a real strict punishment and a lot of specifics to their punishment. What's the reason why Israel should get a stricter punishment?
Because they're the ones with the oracles. They were supposed to be the example to the other nations.
Yes. They were given a close, tight relationship with God. So a lot of people look at the Old Testament and they look at the laws and they think, man, this is strict. Why would they do that? Why is the sentence so severe? Well, because God is literally I shouldn't say literally, but he's essentially holding their hand, walking along with them. If they need to eat, he'll drop out bread from heaven and lay it all over the ground for them. If they're thirsty, he'll have a rock pouring out water. He'll make sure their clothes don't wear out. He was literally leading them right there. And yet people still chose to disregard what he said. So he held them to a higher standard. To whom much is given, much will be required. Well, so it makes sense. Judgment had to come on them. But these nations that were around them, they're going to get judgment too. God's going to do what's right in all this, and he's going to make sure everyone is held accountable for the decisions they choose to make. And so that's the section that we're in right now. We're picking up in the 49th chapter, and the reason why I asked the questions about friends is because we had that whole chapter last week about Moab, the Moabites. Well, today we're going to pick up with the Ammonites, and the Ammonites and Moabites were buddies, if you will. Buddy nations. Oftentimes they would get together and hassle Israel. So they were like-minded foes against the Israelites. And so that's one of the reasons why God is going to offer judgment to them through his prophet Jeremiah. So that's where we pick up in Jeremiah chapter 49. So let's go ahead and read the first 4 verses here. Concerning the sons of Ammon, says the Lord, does Israel have no sons? Or has he no heirs? Why then has Malcolm taken possession of Gad, and his people settled in its cities? Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, that I will cause a trumpet blast of war to be heard against Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. And it will become a desolate heap, and her towns will be set on fire. Then Israel will take possession of his possessors, says the Lord. Wail, O Heshbon, for Ai has been destroyed. Cry out, O daughters of Rabbah, gird yourselves with sackcloth and lament, and rush back and forth inside the walls, for Malcolm will go into exile, together with his priests and his princes. How boastful you are about the valleys. Your valley is flowing away, O backsliding daughter who trusts in her treasures, saying, who will come against me? So the Ammonites and Moabites, who are often united together, they were actually related by descent. So they have some common ancestors in their background. But one of the problems that we see in their history, one of the reasons why they were against the Israelites so much, is because when God sent the Israelites in to take the promised land, because it was time, and they finally did go in, they were told to drive out the inhabitants in that region. Well, these Ammonites occupied some of that region. They did. You remember King Sihon, he was one of their kings, that when Israel said, hey, we need to pass through your land, what was his answer? You're not passing through my land. And then they said, listen, if we drink anything, if we eat anything, we will pay for it, we'll reimburse you, we're not looking for trouble, we just need to pass through. And he said, no, you're not passing through. And then he got his army out there to attack them. So God said, take him over. And he brushed him aside. And they won the battle. So they lost to Israel a long time ago, and they put up a fight, and it was crossing through territories that they could have just gone right through. It's not as though they were heavily guarding them, but when they asked permission, it's like, no, you can't do that. Just a side note, don't you always hate it? I feel like you ask permission and then you get shut down. You're like, I could have just gone through there. I could have just done it. It's a temptation I have. I struggle with that. So this is a problem that they are dealing with way back in the days of the judges even. You remember Jephthah? Does that name sound familiar to you? Remember Jephthah the judge? He was the one that the people appointed because they were desperate, they needed help. And he was centuries earlier, dealing with a land dispute from these same people. They were saying, that land's ours. He's saying, no, go back to your history. It wasn't really yours. And he goes into detail about all that. And there's still war and they're still fighting. So he dealt with the problem back in the days of the judges, but centuries later, it's still being brought up again. Just kind of a reminder to me. Oftentimes problems don't go away. It is helpful to know the past to know, how has this been dealt with in the past? And maybe we can learn from it. That name, Malcolm, is synonymous with the name Milcom, or perhaps you've heard the name Molech. You heard the name Molech? That's what this artist's rendition is. Molech was this pagan god with this bull head that the Ammonites worshipped. It was a real disgusting, despicable kind of worship. They would take this god who would have these hands held out in front of them, and they would light a fire under these hands and just let it burn and let it burn and let it burn until the hands were glowing orange, glowing red hot. Then they would take a child, deliver it into the hands of this god. And that was their practice in offering sacrifices to Molech. It's important to know that because some of the people of God in their history also joined in with this practice. It was a contagious practice, which is, it's so despicable. You think, how could anyone do that? Makes me think it's just a reminder that Satan's got some power, and people aren't stupid. Most people can figure out if something works or it doesn't. Remember even what the New Testament talks about, how sacrifices of the pagans are oftentimes offered to demons. I think Satan had a part in this. He's making good things or things actually happen when they did these sacrifices. Yeah.
What was the purpose of burning the baby like that? Did it have a purpose?
To appease the god and to get the god to bless their land. I don't know the specifics of Molech worship, but yeah, you had to appease your gods, or else, I mean, you can rationalize it because you think, man, if we don't sacrifice one child, how many millions, well, all right, that's too much. How many dozens of us would die by starvation because the crops won't grow? He'll hold back rain. He'll hold back blessings on us, and we'll die. So we have to do this as a sign of loyalty. Yeah.
I read about that when they put the child in his hands, that if the baby or the child falls out of his hands, then it's a good omen.
It's a good omen.
Because he's pouring out blessings.
Pouring out. Boy. You don't want to think about that too long. It's a disgusting form of worship, and it makes sense that God's dealing with. God doesn't deal with people lightly. He takes things seriously. So in the second verse where it talks about the days are coming, well, in the future, Nebuchadnezzar took Ammon and Moab. This would be around the year 582 to 581 BC. And at that time, the Ammonites' king was a guy named Baalis. And Baalis is someone that you read about in the 40th chapter of Jeremiah. He helped with the assassination of Gedaliah. Remember that guy, the guy that tried to bring God's people together after most of them had been deported, and he was trying to get everyone to unite and basically go along with what Jeremiah said, but then he was assassinated by a guy named Ishmael. Well, this Ammonite king also helped out in that process. Jeremiah 40:14. Verse 5, "Behold, I am going to bring terror upon you, declares the Lord God of hosts, from all directions around you. And each of you will be driven out headlong, with no one to gather the fugitives together. But afterward, I will restore the fortunes of the sons of Ammon, declares the Lord." So, how is God going to drive them out of this land? What's the method that he's using? I should have asked that a different way. How's God going to do it? He says, I'm going to bring terror on you. Terror, yeah. I think that's interesting. Have you noticed that's often a trend that God says, in his methods of dealing with enemies and how he's going to punish them? Fear or terror is one of those things that he just pulls it right out and says, I'm going to make you afraid. And we've talked about this. Numerous battles were won largely because people panicked. When people panic, they do dumb things. It's the person who, it's when they're driving and then their car veers off. It's not the fact that it veered off. It's when they panic and they correct too quickly, and then they go in that spiral, it's the panic, right? Well, God uses that sometimes to judge people, and he's had very powerful nations fall to much weaker nations because God used terror. And so that's influential in what's happening here and what he talks about. The thing that I find interesting is, it doesn't say it here, but in a number of other places, God will say, I'm going to send a great fear or a panic or a terror on you. and then you're going to be defeated. And then after that, God will say, then you will know that I am the Lord, right? I've done it. I'm the one responsible for this. It's not some coincidence. It's something that I deliberately made happen. Does it remind you of the beginning of the book of Proverbs? It says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. I think maybe that has meaning even deeper than sometimes we realize. There are a lot of people that are just, they're convinced that their idol's their way, the thing that they're going to do is what's going to work, and if it's not working, we'll just try a little bit harder. But then all of a sudden when God scares them and then they fall, he says, then you're going to know. You're going to have true knowledge that I'm God. Well, same thing. Sometimes that might be in a negative sense. We weren't fearing God enough, and then he does something pretty drastic, and then all of a sudden we're like, but whoa. And then you start thinking, wow, God is God. Kind of shapes your perspective a little bit. So I think it's interesting that those are oftentimes connected together. And verse 6, the way this ends, just like in Moab and in the case of Egypt, God doesn't end on a completely negative note. He says, but afterwards I will restore fortunes. Amen. I will restore. Just throws that little bit in there. Why does he throw that little bit in there? It doesn't seem to fit, does it? So why throw that in there? What's that?
Good question.
Well, thank you. I don't know the answer, that's why I asked it. Okay, nobody else does? I guess we got to move on. I'm going to guess that it has something to do, usually when God talks about afterwards or later on and restoring the fortunes throughout the book of Jeremiah, what is he usually hinting at? Usually he's hinting at the church, right? There's going to come a time where Ammon, they're going to be restored. Or Egypt or some other nation, things are going to work out well. They're going to be restored. God says, take this cup, but this cup isn't filled with any old liquid. What's it filled with? What does God call it? He calls it the wine of his wrath. It's judgment. You're going to drink this. It's like medicine, but of a different kind. Which we talked about it. I don't want to get back to that, but there's other use in the Old Testament law where, we're not sure how to decide this case. You're going to drink this special concoction. Something's going to happen. That's a different thing. But that's the picture here. Is like, well, drink this. This is your judgment. This is your poison. This is what's going to happen to you. And if people say, no, I'm not drinking that. I don't want that. God says, no choice. You're forced to. You have no way around this. That's the cup allusion, right? That's what it's alluding to. Drinking whatever it is that God's destined for you, whatever judgment that's coming your way, better drink it. So that's what he's talking about there. You can't get away from this cup. You've been sentenced to drink it, and you will certainly drink it. Whatever judgment I have for you, God says, it's going to happen to you. Why does God swear by himself? Why?
There's nobody.
What better thing can you swear by? Hebrews even tells us that, right? God swore by himself because he had nothing greater to swear by, which kind of makes sense, right? What better thing can you swear? So that's why God swears by himself to say, as surely as I am, and he is, it's going to happen. There's just no way around it, right? So look at verse 11, though, right at the beginning of this. Leave your orphans behind. I will keep them alive, and let your widows trust in me. Does that sound like judgment to you? I got to be honest with you, I struggle with this one a little bit because we're reading a context where God's just like, bam, take that, bam, take that, bam, take that. But then he throws this one in here, and it doesn't really sound all that harsh. It almost sounds like, and it might well be, that God's looking out for some people who maybe are a little bit helpless. Yeah.
Sounds like he's talking about the men.
Oh, okay.
Soldiers. In other words, when they're dead, that's all there's going to be left is your kids are going to be orphans.
Yes.
Your wives are going to be widows.
Boy, I have to agree with that too. He's talking about the men, and the men are going to leave widows and orphans behind. But he says at the end of verse 11, let your widows trust in me. I mean, I would normally think your widows are going to be lost and helpless, and then they're going to die or something. But he says, let them trust in me. So it does kind of sound like, even though the main thing is the judgment on these people, that for the people who are left, there's still a little bit of a chance, right? Is God a merciful God? Well, he is, even in the Old Testament. Lets people off the hook sometimes for things that they really deserve. So it seems like God is throwing in mercy into a larger context of judgment. And since we just covered it a little while ago, he says, eventually I'm going to restore the fortunes of these people. And he just throws in that one-liner like, oh, but it'll get better. And he moves on to judgment. Because he's been doing that in the context, I see no problem with taking this at face value and saying, but those people who are dragged along and who've gone through a lot, if they put their trust in me, even in the midst of this, even though they are foreigners and they have nothing going for them, if they put their trust in me, I'll take care of them. I'll pull them through this. Are there any examples in the Bible of God coming in and helping people who were not Israelites? God pulling them in. Are there any examples of that? Could someone who was not an Israelite put their trust in God and achieve some sort of salvation or deliverance? I was talking with somebody about Jericho, right? There's one.
Yeah.
What happened in Jericho? You guys all know, but you're too proper to speak. Who helped the spies get into Jericho? A girl by the name of Rahab, a prostitute by the name of Rahab. And God delivered her and her whole family because she put her trust in God instead of the people that they were with. What about a Moabite woman that we know? There's a book named after her in the Bible. Remember Ruth? She was a foreigner, but she said, no, I'm going to stick with Naomi, and the God of the Israelites, that's my God. And God blessed her and saved her as well. That's something that God does, which is such a neat thing. Even back in the Old Testament, you see, it really wasn't, God wasn't pro-Israel only. He wasn't a nationalist in that sense. No, he was looking for anyone who will put his trust in him. It's on that note that I want us to take our 2-minute break, stretch, whatever you can do, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes. The pictures over here, I believe it's from the Biblical Archaeology Society, and these are actually fairly, I think they're from the 80s or so, but they've uncovered all kinds of things from the Edomites. So these are just some pictures of some of the stuff that they've excavated with these people. It's just a reminder. I love the fact, and by the way, if you go look this website up in particular, you have to subscribe to get more details, but tons and tons and tons and tons. You get bored with all the stuff in the Bible that we found in archaeology. There's just so much of it. So it's really neat to be reading about cities, peoples, and groups, and to actually have evidence in the dirt that they really were there. Some of them aren't there anymore, but they were there in that region at that time, and we found evidence of it. So these are just some of the things that we found from the Edomites. Okie dokie, verse 14. I have heard a message from the Lord, and an envoy is sent among the nations, saying, gather yourselves together and come against her, and rise up for battle. For behold, I have made you small among the nations, despised among men. As for the terror of you, the arrogance of your heart has deceived you. O you who live in the clefts of the rock, who occupy the height of the hill, though you make your nest as high as an eagle's, I will bring you down from there, declares the Lord. Edom will become an object of horror, and everyone who passes by it will be horrified and hiss at all its wounds, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah with its neighbors, says the Lord. No one will live there, nor will a son of man reside in it. So, more destruction of Edom. Edom was, and we said this earlier, and it says it well here, they lived in the clefts of the rocks. The Edomite territory was a very hilly territory, very rocky, and some of their locations in particular, one of their chief cities, I believe, did I write it down here? Yeah, the city of Petra Selah or Petra was one that was situated so well in between these high rocky cliffs that there's really only one good way to get in there, and you needed a handful of men and you could defend it. So they were really proud of themselves. They thought, man, we're sitting pretty, we're in the rock, nobody can get to us, and they felt good about that. But in verse 14, you read how God's been coming against them and that they're rising for battle. God kept the Edomites relatively small throughout all their history. They definitely had a ton of back and forth battles, the struggle, which kind of makes sense going back to their ancestors or whatever. What's interesting though is Jacob and Esau, the ancestors, they made peace in their lifetime. But apparently their descendants, their kids, never really made peace. They fought, they bickered, they went back and forth. And God did bless both of them to an extent, but God kept Edom a little bit smaller, a little bit weaker, but they were still a real trouble for Israel that whole time. And then verse 19, there's something else I was going to comment though. Let me see what that is. Oh, the eagle's nest. Does anyone know anything about an eagle's nest? I just know they're really high. I saw them
really big.
Really big and really high? How high up do they make their nests? Does anyone know? I just remember that movie with Jack Black in it where he had to eat the egg of an eagle. Remember that? He's climbing up. I don't know what that movie was. Was it Nacho Libre or something?
They a spot where they can go.
But it's pretty high up there, isn't it? Wow. Okay, I was just curious.
But they're more than 8, some of them are more than 8 foot across.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's massive. That's a big nest. You could sleep in that thing. Get a good night's sleep. Wow, okay. Well, that's the pride. Whether or not they were that powerful, they felt that's who they were, these Edomites, like the eagles. In verse 18, he says it's like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah and its neighbors. Its neighbors would be the surrounding cities of Admah and Zeboim as well. Sodom and Gomorrah, you remember the situation there? What happened with that region? God was there, Lot was there. Only a small handful of godly people, less than 10, or God would have spared it. But he didn't, because there were less than 10 people. The whole town came out when their strangers came to visit and said, oh, let's molest these men. And God and the angels there said, nope, God's done with this place. Lot, you, your wife, everyone get out of here. God's going to destroy this place. And he did. But remember, Lot's wife, she turned around, she looked back, obviously longing, wondering, oh, my home, I miss it. And then what happened to her? She became this new lamp that you could buy that apparently a lot of people pay money for. Salt rock lamps. No. She looked back and she was turned into a pillar of salt. Well, there was raining burning sulfur on that place and it decimated it. And I believe there's even some archaeological evidence they found of that too, which is interesting. Really? You've read about that too?
Seen the video, yeah.
Oh, you have? Sweet. But not necessarily the method. Not the method that God used, but the places became a symbol for complete destruction. Because I mean, if we're nitpicking a handful of people in an entire group of cities, and we can't even get 10 of them, and so God has to get a handful of them out so that before he can even start destroying it, that tells you he's going to destroy it very, very thorough, right? He's not going to miss anything. So they became a symbol. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, these places became a symbol of how thorough God's destruction is. And that's why they're used here. Like Sodom and Gomorrah and its neighbors, no one will live there, nor son of man reside in it. It doesn't mean that God's using burning sulfur again. It just means that God's going to do a good job. He's not going to miss anyone. That's how bad it's going to get for these Edomites. Pretty bad. Verse 19, behold, one will come up like a lion from the thickets of the Jordan against a perennially watered pasture. For an instant I will make him run away from it, and whoever is chosen I shall appoint over it. For who is like me, and who will summon me into court? Who then is the shepherd who can stand against me? This is God speaking through his prophet here. Therefore hear the plan of the Lord, which he has planned against Edom, and his purposes, which he has purposed against the inhabitants of Teman. Surely they will drag them off, even the little ones of the flock. Surely he will make their pasture desolate because of them. The earth has quaked at the noise of their downfall. there is an outcry. The noise of it has been heard at the Red Sea. Behold, he will mount up and swoop like an eagle and spread out his wings against Bozrah. And the hearts of the mighty men of Edom in that day will be like the heart of a woman in labor. Woman in labor, a lot of pain. So in verse 19, he talks about like a lion. It's my understanding that lions are no longer around the region of Palestine anymore. But back in this day they were. And they love to camp out, to hide out in the lush vegetation flowing right by the Jordan River. So you want to go get a drink or cool off, clean up, and surprise, surprise, it was quite a fear for them in that day. And so God's using this analogy of, well, it's like the lion you didn't see coming. I'm coming. I'm coming for you. There's no changing God's ruling. When he talks about himself as a judge, he said, who's going to take me to court? Who's going to contest this? God uses this courtroom analogy all the time just to get people to see there's a verdict and I've decided. And when it's done, it's done. And there is no more supreme court than God. That's about as high as you get, right? That's as high as you get. There is no overruling or overturning or second opinions on God. So he uses the court analogy a lot. Now keep in mind, when he talks about Edom, but then he'll use names of the individual cities, like in Teman in verse 20, and Bozrah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Bozrah. So those places are just illustrations of how God's going to do this. And we've emphasized this before, but let's remind ourselves, if you wanted to thoroughly discuss punishment, if you wanted to say this is how the judgment's going to be, you don't just say, oh, I'm going to kill that guy. If I wanted to kill somebody, but I wanted to emphasize that I'm really killing somebody, I don't just say, well, I'm going to shoot him, he's going to be dead. No, I say, I'm not only going to kill you, I'm going to shoot this hand, I'm going to cut off that arm, I'm going to beat you up first, I'm going to drown you, and then I'm going to, you know what I mean? You start going down all these different things, and you think, whoa, this is a crime of passion. This is pretty thorough. That's what God's doing here, is he's saying, hey, I am serious about what I'm saying. This is not just a little thing I'm going to change my mind on. This is thorough. He wants to emphasize it, and that's how you would do it. So historically, the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, dealt a crushing blow to the Edomites. You read about this in the book of Malachi, chapter 1, verse 3. Then, during the intertestamental period, that period of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament in your Bible there, the Maccabean rulers of Judea, they launched these vicious attacks also against the Edomites. Then you read about, or you hear about the Romans, who continued annihilating them. By the time, that was about the time the Jewish war was against Rome. So throughout history, God's beating them down from all these different places. So Edom, it's just not looking good. So this is where I think we can probably end tonight. Why these judgments? Why? I wanted to emphasize, not all of them, there's still going to be more, and some of these judgments God doesn't explain to us why. I'm sure he has reasons, it's clear he does, but in a few of them he does hint at reasons. Now Egypt, he didn't hint so much, but historically we know Egypt was known for, enslaving God's people, harboring them and then abusing them for their own purposes. Egypt had that reputation, so Egypt used God's people. The Moabites were just thrilled when God's people suffered. They gloated when God's people got hurt. That's what they wanted. The Ammonites were trying to rob God's people. They were trying to steal from them and get whatever they could from them, take advantage of them. And then the Edomites were just like the brothers, their ancestor, they made peace. But the Edomites, they wouldn't make peace with them. They didn't want to be at peace with God's people. They were just angry and upset. Reason why I wanted to put this out here is because I think this isn't just something that happened a long time ago to foreign nations. I see this happening today with individuals too. Do you know what I mean? Do you ever notice, and I don't just mean bad people. Sometimes they're pretty good people, but they will use you. They will manipulate you for their own purposes. Sometimes good people are still happy when you suffer, when a Christian goes through a hard time. Sometimes pretty good people will still take advantage of you if they can. just too much of a temptation not to get out of you what they could. And then in some cases, try as hard as you will. That's why the New Testament says, in so much as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. There are some people, even Christian people, for whatever reason, they don't want to make peace. They don't want to mend that relationship. I hate to think about it, but I've met some of them. I know they're out there. It's a real thing. And I think we need to ask ourselves the same thing. Since I imagine you guys, you've seen these people, you've seen this happen in your life, you've seen it in the church, I've seen it in the church too. And if you see it with other people, then I think it's important we should look at ourselves too and say, man, is this the kind of thing that I do? When I think about the relationships in my life, are there people that I'm on the outs with because, if I'm really honest, I did use them a bit, or I didn't really want to make peace with them, it's too much work, or I took advantage, or I was just a little too thrilled when they stumbled. You know what I mean? I think that's an important question we need to ask, and maybe something we need to reflect on. So that's a goal for this week. Any more thoughts, questions, or comments? All right, thanks for being here, guys. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for how awesome you are. You are a great God, and you're powerful, and you're so far above us in seeing everything at all various times and dealing with it in the best way. And it's just a reminder of how worthy of trust that you are. And there's just so much that we freely admit we don't see. But God, for the things that we do see that are right in front of us, I just want to ask that you help us to learn the lessons that we need to learn. And God, if we are guilty of treating other people in any of these ways, would you please bring it to mind this week and help bring to mind the way that we can mend that relationship and we can make peace, because we know that's what you want, and we know that's ultimately what you've done by sending Jesus here to take our punishment, and we're just so grateful for that. So help us to share that and to live it. And I ask this in your Son's name.